This is The Metro on 1019 WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham. Detroit is one of the most talked about cities in America right now. Its downtown is photographed, its turnaround is praised, and its comeback painted as a lesson for everyone else to follow. But the Detroit most of us know, most residents know, has been flattened into a before and after. Broken and battered, then fixed, bankrupt, then a rebirth. Bought, sold, and renamed. And what gets lost in that flattening is everything that happened in between. During all that time, the part most retellings skipped right over are the people who never left. Businesses opened, political coalitions were formed, museums opened, and whole art forms were invented. Donna Givens Davison has spent almost 40 years inside that story, leading community development work on Detroit's East Side. She's the president and CEO of the East Side Community Network and hosts the Authentically Detroit podcast. In her debut novel, Divining Freedom, she follows one Detroit family across 5 generations in 128 years, writing directly into the history that most comeback stories erase. It's about every family that has to decide who gets remembered and who gets to do the remembering. Donna, welcome back to the Metro.
Thank you.
In a new lens, in a new light. Now, getting right into the book, you built the novel around 6 sections named after books of the Old Testament. We have Exodus, Judges, Jeremiah, Josiah, Lamentations, and Ruth. How did you land on that particular structure, and why not the New Testament?
That's a good question because I am a person who really lives inside the New Testament. When you really look at my faith, it is rooted in everything that Jesus said and did. And so if you look at the theology of the book, you'll see that the theology of the book really speaks to love. And also, we have a real big part of Black Jesus being represented. And what does it mean to love your neighbor? However, there's also this construct, as our people were enslaved. Mm-hmm. A lot of times we looked at exile and we looked at those books as pathways out of our oppression. And so the book begins with a poem, Liberation, where we're really trying to wrestle with what God is. And so it was that pathway out of subjugation to what we're trying to do to achieve freedom that those books kind of narrated. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, 100%. Yes, thank you. And you talked about living in the New Testament. Yeah. How did that manifest when you were writing this book, especially when we're talking about just moving forward, especially moving into a space where we can govern ourselves?
We can govern ourselves. And I think that we came into being on these shores, for the most part. There were African people here long before we were enslaved on these shores, but we came en masse on these shores through subjugation, through having our power denied, through having attempts to strip our history, although, you can't strip who we are from who we are, and it lives on today. But that's our foundation in this nation. And then we've been in this quest to be free without really knowing what freedom looks like. I was just looking at this book about utopian societies and how utopian societies sometimes replicate the same kind of hierarchy and injustice that you're trying to escape. And so this book kind of contends with that, that we're trying to be free, and yet sometimes, even in our attempts to be free as American people, we end up reproducing certain types of things. It really is more than one family. There are 5 or 6 families that are starts with one family, right? And one of the main characters starts in the just post-Reconstruction South, post-Civil Rights South. Right around the time of Reconstruction, he's born into a family where his mother understands partial freedoms. His father enslaved his mother. His mother was born into slavery and married a white man and he's born into this thing where he sits at the sort of in the space between blackness and whiteness and never really having a firm sense of belonging, and goes to become a medical doctor and ends up in a town that was founded by Black people called Freedom. And even within freedom, you have hierarchy. And then he goes to medical school and ends up in Detroit. And in Detroit, even among people who have escaped the Jim Crow South, you have hierarchy. And he is at the top of that hierarchy from the time he was born. Mm-hmm. And then you have other people who come through Jim Crow situations where they're at the very bottom. One of my favorite characters, I think I love them all, I fell in love with everybody I wrote about, is this man who was born in Georgia, and he was really smart and very creative and very inventive. And everybody around him knew, and they say, that boy sure is special. But he ends up in Detroit on an assembly line. Mm-hmm. And everything special about him gets flattened by the automotive process, flattened by and crushed by a system that does not see him as a man, does not see him as equal. And he's trying to live in this promised land without really feeling free. And I think that he is as intelligent, as capable as a guy who was actually given privilege, even in this period of antebellum South. Even in this period, he's given privilege that puts him over this other guy. Mm-hmm. And yet neither of them is free. Mm-hmm. And so now you have the next generation, and more than those two, but now you have the next generation. And the next generation kind of comes to be in around 1967. And when you said I've been here for dealing with this for about 40 years, actually about 61. Mm-hmm. I was born in 1963, and my parents moved from Ann Arbor, where my dad was in medical school, to Detroit in about 1965. And so most of my years I've worked in or lived in the city of Detroit. But in 1967, this is a period where you're seeing the Black Power movement has already been in place in Detroit, right? And the book sort of narrates that. Mm-hmm. This is where the Nation of Islam was born. Mm-hmm. This is where the Republic of New Africa was born. This is where the Shrine of the Black Madonna was born, mm-hmm. and so many other movements. I mean, the UNIA under Marcus Garvey had a very large chapter in the city of Detroit. And Detroit was a place of Black pride and opportunity, largely because you had Henry Ford here. And Henry Ford, despite his horrific anti-Semitism, despite his horrific racism, paid everybody the same wage. And there's reasons why he did that. You know, if you pay Black people and white people the same wage, it's going to be really hard to form a union and fight against him. And so I think it was very intentional to create this class of people who could keep the plants going if white people decided to strike. And that was something industrialists tried all over the nation, but which led to a lot of racial conflict and pogroms.
Now, 1967, because I want to get there, mm-hmm. It was such a pivotal role.
Yes.
A pivotal year for the city of Detroit. What happened to the opportunity in the city after that?
So 1967 was pivotal in that you had more than two groups, but you had like this group of Black people who were really, really engaged in the politics of the city of Detroit in 1967. Under a mayor who considered himself to be a liberal and who was considered himself to be all-embracing, and Detroit was really looked at as a model for a model city, mm-hmm. right? And yet you had Black underclass that was still living with severe housing segregation, living with severe police brutality, and these communities coexisted. And what happened after 1967 was the Black middle class, the integrationists, dominated the political sphere in Detroit, the social sphere in Detroit. And in 1967, there were industrialists and powerful people who said, wait a minute, you guys misled us. We had no idea this was coming. Yeah. And so now you see the empowerment of Black liberation movements inside of Detroit. You start seeing predecessors to Operation Get Down, and you start seeing the inner city subcenter formed and supported by an organization like New Detroit. And these Black power organizations, which had already been here, began to be institutionalized. And so you had white flight, you had police repression, you had the flight of capital, but you also had a Detroit, which I grew up in, where Black people really felt like we were free. I grew up in Detroit where Black people did not, for the most part, really believe that racism still had power over them. Yeah. I remember when I was in high school in around 1980, I belonged to a youth group and we were on a radio show. And the question was, does racism still exist in Detroit? And are we still fighting it? And people didn't see it because everywhere you looked, the principal was black, the teachers were black, city council was black, the school board was black, the mayor was black. You had white people here, but they did not have power over black people, except in some neighborhoods. And so we grew up really believing that we were free. I grew up at a time of rapid, widespread upper mobility among black people who might be the first generation of people to graduate from high school, much less college, the first generation to go to college, and so many skilled professional people were birthed in that time frame. And the crazy thing about it is a lot of them are still here. They're just not in the city of Detroit. They are in Metro Detroit. And so as we talk about Detroit as a city of poor black people, people need to understand that Metro Detroit is a metropolitan area with a lot of economic diversity among black people, a lot of educational achievement, business ownership, and many great things that were birthed around the time of 1967.
This is the Metro. I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about Divining Freedom. My guest is the author of Divining Freedom, Donna Givens Davidson, because you just laid out so much, and like so much of who you are helped inform this book. You, of course, write a lot of things in the book, but one of the things that stands out to me, of course, is when you're talking about the edge of 67, the rebellion looming over the city, and you capture that in the chapter Bitter Fruit. What did you want readers to feel just before everything changes in Detroit? Because you're talking about it now, but like as you're writing, what did you want the readers to take away from that chapter in particular?
I don't know. I want people to understand to look at people as people.
Yes.
Not as statistics, not as norms and everything like that. I wanted to create and flesh out humans.
Yes.
And see how those humans were, moving through the city through all of these eras. So, I should know exactly what I wrote the book, but let me make sure I remember which one is. That's the one. That's a story about Elias, who was born in, I thought so. He was born in Georgia, and he came to Detroit, and he was this really smart kid, and he ends up in the city. And so this is actually written pre-1967.
Yes.
Now, what happens after 1967 is his daughter Dolores is at Harvard, and his daughter Dolores, he ends up leaving his family and abandoning his daughter, believing that the greatest gift he had to give her was his absence. Okay. And so she's very close to her father. She feels very rejected because of the way classism and colorism and all of those isms work. And so she works her way at Harvard Law School, and she's watching Harvard, not Harvard, Barnard, because women weren't at Harvard. She was at Barnard just preparing to go to college or to transfer to Barnard. And at this point in time, she's looking at Detroit on TV, at the riots on TV. She's kind of escaped it. Mm-hmm. She's worried about her father. But then she also realizes she lost her father, and she realizes that it's her responsibility to carry on the legacy and be the man, or to live the life he never got to live. She renames herself. She rebrands herself, and she decides, I'm going to come back and I'm going to be in control. I'm not going to allow these people who look down on me. And so she's kind of bitter. She's got a very interesting relationship with her mother, who felt very exploited by her father and very mistreated by her daughter. And so she's kind of a person without a village or a home or a community to really sustain her. And it's kind of a sad truth that some people ended up, all by themselves. And a lot of those people didn't have a sense of loyalty or connectedness to the communities that they were in. Even though they had opportunity, they didn't necessarily feel loved, respected, or included. And so even as there were some people who came out of all of these circumstances who became pillars of the community and wanted to lift all of their people, there were others who just wanted to get ahead and didn't have that connectedness and didn't even, she changed her name.
Yeah, didn't want to even deal with that pressure and that burden of having that. I mean, she wanted to make sure that she could escape that, and changing your name is one way to escape some of that burden.
She changed her name, changed her looks, realized as a young woman that she was actually beautiful, even though as when she was in high school, she didn't. And some of it had to do with hair, because colorism is also texturism, right? And so she had split ends and she didn't have beautiful hair in her mind. And so just by putting on a wig, she felt beautiful and she could see finally, wait a minute, I'm a beautiful woman. And maybe other people could see that. And so I wanted to deal with it because I don't think that you can deal with a Detroit that doesn't deal with the way that people grow up feeling very oppressed by other Black people. Detroit is a city that is majority Black, but you have colorism, classism, educationism, if that's a word. You have this whole, all of these isms that intersect, that create, that contribute to, so even after white people leave, right? Now you've got Black people as agents of some of the harms that are done to each other. And I think that's true in many post-colonial places across the world where when white people leave, first of all, their money doesn't, the power of their money doesn't, and also the norms that they set in place while colonizing your place still exist. And so I look at Detroit as a post-colonial place where the white people's bodies left, their money stayed and still had control. Even as Capital Flight left, they still controlled many institutions. And yeah. Yes,
Donna, because you talk about such an interesting point, and we're going to get back to after 67 because I do want to get into the dash and that flattened Detroit that we often overlook. And you were talking about how that time after 67 was the birth of so many what it looked like, at least to manifest the audacity to be Black in the city of Detroit. So before we get there, though, if you could just expand just a little bit briefly about that. I've been having a conversation here at the station about just white flight at that time and how not only did white flight take place, but we also saw a lot of Black people leave the city as well.
Not then. Not then.
Yeah.
In 1967, Black people stayed.
Okay.
And what Black people did is they moved into the neighborhoods that were abandoned by the people who were fleeing Detroit.
Okay.
And so at that point in time, all through my childhood, Black people, there were some Black people who did leave.
Yeah.
But the majority of Black people, including Black middle class people, stayed in Detroit and built institutions where they were sort of living in these very protected areas. So you had neighborhoods like Boston Edison, you had Lafayette Park, you had Indian Village, you had Palmer Woods and Sherwood Forest, and even more exclusive Golf Course Street, Private Drive, where you, and then you had, the whole Bagley community. You had the whole East English Village community, Black people moving into brick houses and places that felt very safe. And so the Black middle class stayed and cemented its power. And to a certain extent, as that Black middle class stayed and cemented its power, it reproduced some of the hierarchy. So now you have Black people owning slum apartments. You have Black people who are presiding over systems that oppress. You have Black judges who are throwing, the people in prison forever. And they had names and, you had Black police officers who replaced white police officers. And to a certain extent, it made things better. But hierarchy ends up being the oppressive force, and Black people occupying hierarchy might be a little bit more sympathetic to other Black people, but you still had hierarchy. And so this growth of interracial hierarchy in Detroit seemed to really happen in that period across America, but certainly in Detroit.
Yes. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into the era after 67, before the bankruptcy in Detroit, and we'll talk about that dash, that flattening of the city's history. I'll continue my conversation with Donna Givens Davison, author of Dividing Freedom. You all stay right there. This is The Metro. This is The Metro on 1019 WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham. Donna Givens Davidson has spent almost, you said 61
61
years. So almost 61 years inside this story, leading community development work on Detroit's East Side, as well hosting the podcast Authentically Detroit. We're discussing her debut novel, Divining Freedom. In it, she follows Detroit families across 5 generations in 128 years. Now, getting back to the 67 rebellion and the bankruptcy comeback and this whole little dash right in between that. What did you want to build, or why did you want to build the novel inside this particular dash? What was so important to highlight, and especially to use humans to tell that story?
Well, first of all, because people lived through it. And there are many criticisms, right? You can hear people criticize various institutions and groups of people. We're always trying to figure out who's at fault. And so you asked about the structure of the novel. Let me just talk about that. So the novel was supposed to begin around 1972, 1973. And so I started with, the first person I wrote about was Zion. And Zion was this great child, and then Talitha was going to be his wife, and both of them were going to be, growing up in this church. And so then I realized Zion had to have parents, and his parents had to have parents. And as I looked at them, I was like, wait a minute, this is kind of unsympathetic. Like, Talitha's mother is like out cold, right? She is not a good person. Yeah. But she came from somewhere. And so it turns out that she was born in circumstances that are really tragic, and her mother was born in circumstances that are really tragic. And they came to Detroit actually believing that they were going to escape something that was really tragic. And so tragedy sometimes was the consequence of this quest for freedom. And now you're in the 1970s, and so you have these 2 young people who are going to fix things, right? And so I wanted to go back and explain how things got broken so that people could have a sense that things did not get broken on their own. There are a couple other themes that I explored in there that I think is important for me to talk about. One is that, this idea of the Black church as a place of liberation. I ran a nonprofit for a Black church and got really into church politics. And from the outside, I was never really an insider in that church, but I also observed a lot. One of the things that happened, I'm going to go forward to the early aughts, or the early 2000s, when you had, which is when I started this community development work inside a church. You had so many people saying things like, home ownership is the American dream. Everybody has the right to home ownership. Help us sell these mortgages. You had companies like Countrywide coming to churches and nonprofits and offering money and setting up workshops and getting people signed up. And so this idea that this is going to be a pathway to freedom. And then you have the predatory loan crisis and the housing crisis that ended up stripping people who'd owned homes for generations of property they owned. But it was done with good intentions. And I think it's important that people understand that nobody set out to, in the Black community, set out to, for the most part, strip Black people of their wealth. Sometimes we can be agents of destruction without knowing that we're agents of destruction, because we're trying to function within a system that is determined to exploit, predate, or control us. And so one of the themes I was trying to bring about was that these institutions that we built, for good reason, sometimes became damaged. Yes. Things happened in Detroit beyond 1967, right? 1981, what happens? The collapse of the auto industry, the collapse of the economy. I graduated from high school in 1981. And people I grew up with, now I grew up in a privileged background, so the people I grew up with all knew they were going to college. But I had friends who didn't. Yeah. And who thought they were just going to work for the plant. When the plant stopped hiring, where's your opportunity? Plants are paying union wages. You can get overtime. Now, all of a sudden, you can't get overtime. Where's your opportunity? You have people who are not prepared for a world where all of the opportunity was stripped away. And at the same time, right around the same time, you have the United States government funding a war in Nicaragua by allowing Contra people, this group of people in Nicaragua that are opposing this new so-called socialist government, the Sandinistas, the Contras, come here. And they're allowed to start selling crack cocaine inside of cities. And it started in Los Angeles, but it became really big in Detroit, in a city where the opportunity had been stripped away. this looked like opportunity for some young people. And it absolutely destroyed so many families.
And this is when we see the gang wars and the, yes. Okay.
And so we tell them, like, these bad people came and these terrible people and they don't care about life. The reality is they're living in a system that no longer supports them, never supported them fully. You have this, buildup of mass incarceration. And so the children of automotive dream promises are left without any hope. And hope is so important to, mobility. Hope is so important to people trying to adapt to a new economy. And when people lose it, the whole social structure of the community can fall apart. And we started seeing that in the 80s and 90s. And so as much as we can talk about predatory lending, we have to talk about the fact that our own government helped facilitate a drug trade inside of urban communities, while at the same time you have the automotive industry kind of stripped from our community in meaningful ways, and this sense of being completely left out of whatever it is that your parents came here for. And so that's another story. And there's all stories about people coming here looking for freedom and not getting it. And so that's the tragedy, right? But I want to say, growing up in Detroit, I loved being here. And again, I know that I had relative privilege, and I know that I didn't have a lot of things that other people did. But, listen, I grew up at a time where funk music was great. People talk about Motown. They don't talk about the fact that George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic and all of those music forms were really formed right here in the city of Detroit, because George Clinton came here to Motown. And they innovated and they created this new music that was so amazing for my childhood. Prince got discovered in Detroit. We had a radio show host named Mojo, and Mojo helped make Prince somebody. So when Prince would come to Detroit, he would always acknowledge that Detroit was where he got his start. The music culture going, and people, again, they've moved into these neighborhoods. People have basements and backyards. And basement and backyard parties were like everything to me. And so we had joy. We had this pride. We had the sense of who we are. And that evolved into, in the late 80s, a friend of mine, George Baker, formed this entity called the Music Institute. And he ended up marrying my college roommate, Erica Gardner. And so George and Erica formed the Music Institute. And they bring Bellevue, I always get these names, Belleville 3. Belleville 3.
Yeah.
And so, they start playing this music, and it becomes, Detroit techno. And Detroit techno becomes international. And so, listen, I was here through funk music. I was here through Detroit techno. We saw the construction of the Renaissance Center, and everything that meant to a Detroiter who, wait a minute, this is our mall, right?
Yeah.
And so we had all of these things form in our wake. Charles Wright and the Wright Museum built its first museum, and then a second museum, which became the largest African-American museum in the nation until the Smithsonian. And I have to say this, my husband, Kevin Davidson, has worked at the Charles Wright Museum for 43 years. And so, but if you go to Michigan Central, they have this little thing where they show a little film that shows the history of Detroit. And if you watch it, you can see that there's all of this stuff that's going on. You see the Supremes and Motown. And then you fast forward to today, and they skip the entire part of Detroit that matters to me the most. And that's where it feels like erasure. And that's where I'm trying to color this story back in and make our people human, not symbols. Help people understand how people become who they are, and also how some of the mistakes that got made along the pathway to liberation got made, not because people were bad or corrupt. Maybe they became corrupted and did bad things, but because people were trying to exist within a system that did not really love them.
Now, Donna, before we get out of here, because we're coming down to the wire, you're writing a historical fictional like this, Divining Freedom, can help change a legacy, can help change a narrative. What part of Detroit's story do you hope will change as a result of this particular book? In what way do you want residents, non-residents, or people who are just in general looking to learn more about the city, what do you want them to take away from this book?
I want them to love us. I want them to love us like I do. I want people who are Black to look at this and love themselves. And I get so much good feedback from people. It's like, that's my grandfather, that's my grandmother. And they can connect to those stories. I remember when I watched Minister Society for the first time. It was about this people, young boys who were killing each other. But you saw their humanity. I remember when I watched The Wire the first time, and you saw the humanity of everybody in there trying to do the right thing and doing the wrong thing anyway. But what you didn't see was a bunch of villains. I tried not to create villains. I tried to create people that you could identify with or at least understand. So mostly I want people to have understanding. I think it's really hard to make really bad public policy decisions against people you come to love and understand. And I love Detroit. I love Detroiters. I've had the privilege of working among so many different groups of people. And I'm so blessed to live inside of a community with this kind of diversity of who we are as a people. I also want to point out that I tried to also be very inclusive. So I do have a gay character in here and his experiences in Detroit because, that's important too. And I think sometimes what we do is we decide to erase some identities in favor of others. So I've got a sex worker, I've got a gay character, I've got the kind of people who are sometimes thrown away in the annals of history. And I want you to love them too, because, I think walking away, the central thesis of my book is that love heals. And that if you're going to be free, you're going to include women in your freedom, because women have been at the centerpiece of bringing love to our families and communities since forever. And so I also end with this hopeful note about Black women stepping into our own as leaders. Coincidentally, I finished it when we had our first Black woman mayor, but I certainly didn't start with this idea even before I knew she was going to get here. I knew we needed a Black woman to stand in that place because I do believe in the power of Black women. And
Yes, Donna, that is it for our conversation. Donna Givens Davison is the author of Divining Freedom and the president and CEO of Eastside Community Network. I could literally talk to you the rest of the hour. I could the rest of the day. Donna, thank you so much for joining us on The Metro.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. The Metro is hosted by Robin Vincent and me, Tia Graham. It's produced by Sam Corey and Alex McLennan. Our engineer is Nate Bender, and our senior producer is David Lyons. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. And this is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. You all have a great day.